Hello and welcome to Dollars and Cents, the Australia Institute podcast where we explain just what the hell is going on in the economy. My name is Eleanor Johnston-Leake and I'm a senior content producer here at the Australia Institute. Greg is away on a well-deserved holiday this week, so today I'm joined by our senior economist, Matt Grudnoff. Hello, Matt.
G'day.
Happy new financial year to you.
Happy financial year to you and all those that celebrate.
Yeah, is that just economists?
Well, I feel it's more accountants, but yes, definitely economists celebrate.
It's New Year for accountants in the way that budget is Christmas for economists.
That's right. It comes after Christmas, but not that far after Christmas.
And so with the new financial year, we've got a few changes coming in that will bring some financial relief to a few people. So what's the biggest change?
Well, the biggest change by far is the Stage 3 tax cuts.
Every Australian worker will get more money in their pocket after the Prime Minister's shake-up to the Stage 3 tax cuts.
Tax breaks for the country's highest earners will be halved and the money used to deliver cuts to more people as rates and thresholds are reworked.
Everybody who's paying tax and is working will get a tax cut.
Anthony Albanese conceded to senior ministers today he is breaking an election promise, but insists he's doing it for the right reason.
We need big reforms. And indeed, Anthony Albanese's decision to recast Scott Morrison's 2018 tax cuts to suit the economy of 2014 is the biggest and most honest piece of tax reform in Australia for decades.
They're worth $23 billion for the next financial year, and they're going to see every taxpayer in Australia get a tax cut. So they're going to provide quite a bit of financial relief for people that might be struggling right now.
And so when will people start seeing the benefits of these tax cuts? They have to wait until they actually lodge their taxes?
Yeah, so the last time we got a tax cut, people might remember, was the mailto, the low and middle income tax offset. And that was one of those weird ones where you didn't get it until you put your tax return in. But this is entirely different. So it's paid, every fortnight if that's when you get paid. It should appear with your next pay packet.
Very exciting. I will look forward to that. So here at the Australia Institute, we've sort of been railing against the Stage 3 tax cuts for a while. It's been a few years now. So aren't these a bad thing? Why should we be happy about this?
Yeah, look, we were against the Stage 3 tax cuts for a long time. And these were announced way back by then Treasurer Scott Morrison. So this was even before he was Prime Minister. This was back when Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister. And these tax cuts were originally terrible. They were massively stilted to the top end. Half of the tax cuts went to people earning more than $180,000 a year. And if you earned less than $45,000 a year, you would have got nothing. So these would have flattened the income scales. They were really terrible. But the Australia Institute basically for 6 years fought really hard to have these change. We said they were bad policy. We said that they would make Australia more unequal. We produced research. We produced events. We did all sorts of stuff and we railed against them. And finally, the Labor Party earlier this year agreed with us and changed them. And so now these tax cuts are not nearly as stilted to the top end.
Yeah. So how many reports exactly did you, because I remember you writing quite a few of those reports.
Yeah, over the 6 years, I think we worked out, I wrote 20 reports.
Oh my gosh.
just on this. And that doesn't include all of the op-eds and all of the events and all the radio and television interviews. And it wasn't just me. The other economists at the Institute, Dave Richardson, Greg Jericho, who usually does this podcast, we all worked really hard because they were really terrible policy.
Yeah. And so what are the changes with the new ones? How are these better?
Yeah, these tax cuts are a lot better. So rather than nobody earning below $45,000 getting any of the tax cut, every taxpayer now gets a tax cut. So if you pay tax, you'll get part of this tax cut. And also, for everybody earning between $45,000 a year and $135,000 a year, you'll get about an extra $31 on top of what you would have got before, an extra $31 a fortnight. Or about $800 a year because of the changes to these tax cuts. Now, between 45 and 135, that's over half of all of taxpayers.
Yeah.
And then there are some that are going to miss out a bit. So everybody over about $147,000 a year, they're going to get slightly less. They're still going to get a big tax cut. In fact, they're going to get a bigger tax cut than everybody else.
Yeah.
They just won't. They were actually just going to get a massive tax cut under the old stage 3. The new stage 3, they'll get less. So if you earn $200,000 a year, rather than getting $9,000 a year, you'll only get $4,500 a year.
I mean, $4,500 still not bad.
They'll have to struggle through with just $4,500 a year.
Yeah. So there's been a lot of criticism that the stage 3 tax cuts are going to cause inflation. Is there any merit to that argument?
No, I don't think there is. I think it's overblown. So there are two kinds of inflation. There's the most common kind of inflation is what we call demand side inflation. That's the economy is doing really well, everything's booming, people's incomes are rising, they're rushing out and they're spending. Firms can't keep up with the extra demand. They put up their prices, and that's where the inflation comes from. And that's the kind of inflation where higher interest rates, for example, work really well against. There's this really unusual form of inflation called supply side inflation. It happens when there's a supply shock. And that's the kind of inflation we're facing now.
So when you say a supply shock, what would that be?
Yeah, so that we had actually quite a number of supply shocks. It was set off originally by the economy emerging from COVID. The invasion of Ukraine massively increased energy prices, oil and gas prices. There were a number of floods and other climate disasters. You might remember fruit and veg. Lettuces became really difficult to get and really expensive for a while. These are the kinds of things that the economy faced, and these were the supply shocks. And the other big one was, because prices were going up, firms actually took advantage of this in Australia and increased prices by even more, took a bit extra profit, and because they were increasing prices by more than the increasing costs, that also added to inflation. So because it was all on the supply side, then increasing demand doesn't really add much to this inflation. I don't think when the stage 3 tax cuts come in, they're going to make very much difference at all to this inflation.
So you mentioned profit gouging there. So why would firms choose now to profit gouge? Can't they just do that all the time?
Yeah, look, that is an absolutely fantastic question. And to answer it, we have to go back in time a bit. You might remember that in the years leading up to that kind of inflationary spike after COVID, prices were really flat. Wages were really flat. Nothing really increased. And so if you were a firm and you put your prices up at a time when everybody else is not putting their prices up and consumers aren't expecting it, consumers are going to go, hey, wait, you're ripping me off. I'm not going to buy your stuff. I'm going to buy somebody else's stuff. But you might remember as we led into this inflationary spike, because it was happening all around the world, there was all this talk about how prices are going to go up. Consumers were primed to expect prices going up. And so what firms thought, my customers think prices are going to go up. They don't know how much prices are actually going to go up. But when prices suddenly go up in the supermarket or in the shops, they're not going to be surprised and outraged by it. They're going to go, oh, well,
Yeah, that's how it is at the moment.
That's how it is.
Yeah.
So now is the time for me to strike.
Yeah.
Because the Australian economy has become a lot less competitive over the last couple of decades, there wasn't the constraint that competition has at keeping prices down. And so firms just said, well, my costs have gone up by, say, 10%. I'm going to put my prices up by 15% or 20% and, take advantage of this moment when consumers are expecting prices to rise. And that's exactly what they did. And so what we've seen is particularly big businesses, those kind of dominant firms with all the market power, their profits have massively expanded over the last few years, at the same time that their costs have also increased. So that means they must be profit gouging. But the big problem for the economy from this is if they put up their prices by more than costs, then obviously that adds even more to inflation, which means that we need, the Reserve Bank has stepped in and put up interest rates higher for longer because of that.
So you say that competition's getting worse in that there's less of it in Australia. Is that unique to Australia, or is that sort of a global problem?
Yeah, it is a global problem, but Australia is particularly bad. So in economics, we call this, we would say that Australia is full of oligopolies. Now, an oligopoly is a market where there's a couple of really big firms that dominate. They have kind of a cozy relationship. Think Coles-Woolies, think the big four banks, right? They pretend to kind of be in competition, but really they're quite happy both to have high prices, make big profits, and just enjoy their dominance of the market. That's what we call an oligopoly in
Bit of
economics.
a tongue twister.
Yeah. And Australia is now full full of oligopolies. If you think of all the different kind of industries when you go out and you buy stuff, usually there's a couple of really big firms, 2, 3, 4, that basically dominate the market. And that's bad for competition because those are the firms that can basically charge higher prices. We have to pay a bigger price and they get a bigger profit.
So why are they able to charge a higher price when there's an oligopoly?
Yeah, so if it was instead a highly competitive market, so let's pick one, coffee shops, right?
There's lots of those.
Yeah, there's heaps of them and they compete. So if you went to a coffee shop and the coffee was crap or the price was high, you're just going to walk further down the street and go to another
2
one.
2 meters along and there's another one.
Exactly right. So each coffee shop has to compete on price and has to compete on quality. But if you don't like Coles and Woolies because they're giving you a high price and not a particularly great service, there's not a lot of other options available. There is Aldi and there are sort of, IGAs and Metcash and other kind of options, but you're really limited in how many other options you can. And so Coles and Woolies can charge a higher price, earn a bigger profit, and the consumers are the ones that suffer.
The federal opposition wants the power to break up major supermarket chains if they're found guilty of ripping off customers and suppliers.
If evidence emerges that the big chains inflated prices, exploited supply chains or acted anti-competitively, the watchdog could apply to the courts for the companies to be broken up.
Our policy is about supporting consumers.
Putting the coalition on an unlikely unity ticket with the Greens.
Menzies tried to ban the Communist Party. They want to adopt the Communist Party model.
It is now just the Australian Labor Party that is standing in between millions of Australian shoppers and cheaper food and grocery prices.
This is madness. I mean, this is what happens when a party forgets who they are and adopt a Greens economic policy. Congratulations, Senator McKim. Welcome to the Shadow Cabinet.
And speaking of supermarkets, Dutton had a big announcement this week about the supermarkets. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, Dutton and the coalition came up with a great policy along with the Greens. It's great to see the Greens and the coalition working together. They basically came out and suggested that we should take on these things called divestiture powers. And what that means is if the government or the ACCC or the courts, it really depends on how the laws are written, but if they decide that there isn't enough competition in a market and the firms in it are abusing their market power, and particularly this is aimed at the supermarkets, then the government can come in and force the big players and break them up. So we might take Coles and Woolworths and we might break Coles and Woolworths up into 6 different firms. And then so rather than being 2 giant firms dominating the market, we suddenly have 6 firms who are then all competing with each other. So we move more towards the kind of coffee shop competition rather than the current oligopoly that we have.
And then this will increase competition in the markets and then, hopefully make prices and services better, I suppose. Yeah.
Exactly right. So one of the problems we have in Australia with our competition laws is we have lots of laws around mergers and acquisitions. So the government tries to stop big firms from merging. So if Coles and Woolies decided, well, actually, we're going to merge and just form one super firm, the ACCC and the government would probably say, no, you can't do that, right? So we can stop oligopolies from forming, or we can try to. They haven't been really successful with it. But once we have an oligopoly, we don't really have any way of injecting more competition in. And usually the way the government responds is to regulate prices. So every year, for example, electricity prices. Basically, there's a court, effectively what is a court case, and then an independent umpire works out how much electricity prices are going to go up. And we do that because there isn't a lot of competition in the electricity market, and the government's effectively, well, what do? Well, we'll introduce more regulation. But that's not as effective as competition. So these divestiture powers are a really good idea because they allow markets that are already not competitive to be broken up.
And is this something that's done elsewhere in the world effectively.
Yeah, it was really interesting. So while the Coalition and the Greens are on board with this, the Labor Party not so much. And in particular, Albanese has said that these are Soviet-style communist...
Oh, the Red Scare.
So let's talk about the communist countries that have divestiture power. That well-known communist country, the United States of America, they have had divestiture powers for over 100 years.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Another well-known communist country, the United Kingdom, run by those Tories, well, at least as of the timing of this podcast.
Yeah, maybe not for much longer.
That might change shortly. They have divestiture powers. So divestiture powers are actually really common in developed countries. And very not communist, very capitalist nations have these because competition is what makes market economies work. And if you don't have a way of injecting competition into markets, then your market economy is not going to work very effectively.
And so are these proposals for divestiture just aimed at the supermarkets?
Yeah, so if I had one criticism of them, it's just that they're aimed at this one sector, which obviously is an oligopoly. But Australia, as I said, is full of oligopolies. And there are plenty of other areas where we should have these same powers. So I think these divestiture powers should be economy-wide. So think about banking. We have the big four banks. Imagine if we broke those up and we had a more competitive banking sector. Insurance costs are going through the roof at the moment. There's only a few insurance companies. We could break up insurance companies and introduce more competition. There are plenty of markets in Australia where these divestiture laws could help break up and create more competition. And the great thing about the divestiture laws is you don't actually even have to use them to get a better outcome. Imagine if you were a big cozy oligopoly like Coles-Woolies and suddenly the government passed divestiture powers and you're thinking, holy crap, I don't want to get broken up. So they might actually change their behaviour. They might actually start to really compete. So even if the powers are never used, if they change the behaviour of these big dominant firms, whether it's in groceries or whether it's in banking or insurance or any other market in the economy, these can be really valuable tools changing firms' behaviour and getting a better deal for consumers.
So when you say changing firms' behaviour, do you mean in terms of like lowering prices?
That's exactly right. So firms often say they like competition. They're lying to you, right? Competition means I have to work harder to get customers. I have to give them a lower price, and so I make a lower profit. And then I have to be really nice to them and offer them great service so they'll come back.
So difficult.
It's so difficult. Whereas, if I'm a big monopoly or oligopoly, then I can charge them a high price. I can tell them to get nicked, knowing that they've got nowhere else to go, right? So that's what, that's a lot easier to make money that way and keep your shareholders happy. So because of that, firms will resist this kind of more competition. So if divestiture powers are kind of hanging over them, then they're going, well, I don't want to offer lower prices, but if I go too far, the government or the ACCC or somebody could step in, break us up, and then I'm going to have to compete anyway. So instead of doing that, what I'll do is I'll offer lower prices and better service to customers in order to keep those divestiture powers at bay.
So when the government's assessing whether something is an oligopoly, do they just take into account like prices or the size of the market share or?
Yeah, all of those things. So there'd be a large assessment of the market. You might have 3 firms that really compete really hard that are not useful and divestiture wouldn't be needed. But you might have 4 big, fat, lazy oligopolies that aren't competing. So absolutely price and how much profit the firms are making, as well as how many firms are in the market and how dominant they're in the market. But it really comes down to behaviour, because that's what competition is supposed to produce. It's supposed to produce the kind of behaviour where consumers are the winners. There was a famous price-fixing case years ago, and the owner of the company that was found guilty of price fixing came out and he was looking very sad, and he said, look, in these kind of cases, the only winners out of competition are consumers. And he was looking very dejected. And it was kind of like, I remember hearing that and thinking, yeah, that's the point, right? You're not supposed to be the winners from this. What we want are lower prices for consumers, not bigger profits for big business.
Yeah, no, not much sympathy there.
Not at all.
Thanks very much, Matt, and thank you for listening. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the show today. You can reach out to us via email at podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au, Or you can find us on Twitter at the Oz Institute, and that's with an AUS. Our theme music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Eleanor Johnston-Leake, and I'll see you next week. Bye, Matt.
See you, Eleanor.